Welcome back. I'm trying something a little bit different with my format for this video. Not too many people are watching anyway, so I may as well throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. We'll see how this goes. Um, Fair warning, there is going to be probably a lot more of me talking and me being on camera than anybody really wants. And also, it is a bit of a long video, so you've been warned. Anyway, so if anybody peeked over the fence into my backyard, and I'm really hoping that that's not a regular occurrence, they would probably understandably draw the conclusion that I am a raised bed gardening fanatic. After all, I have so many of the damn things back there that most days I can't walk around without bashing my shins into one of them. The truth, however, is those raised beds were simply a solution to a problem, and I really wish I didn't have to have them. The reason being is, of course, raised beds are expensive. You have to buy the lumber to build them, and then you have to have the soil trucked in or other grow medium trucked in to fill them. The dirt is actually the most expensive part of the whole thing. And I'm not sure who coined the phrase dirt cheap, but they definitely weren't a vegetable gardener. Anyway, I really wish that it had been an option for me just to rent a tiller for an afternoon, till up a bunch of soil, maybe stir in some fertilizer and amendments, and be good to go. Unfortunately, that just wasn't the case. Shortly after moving in, when we were attempting to set up our first year's vegetable garden out there, we found our soil to be so heavy in clay that saying we are sitting atop a clay slab isn't inaccurate. How bad could it be, you might ask? Well, take a look. Here is a sample of soil from our backyard that I grabbed last January when the ground was still nice and saturated. As you can see, it's moldable, it's dense. You could actually, if you wanted to, probably shape something out of this and fire it, which is, in fact, what I decided to do just out of curiosity. I formed a sample of it into a disc, and then out of curiosity threw that disc onto some hot coals when we were having a fire last year, just to see what would happen. And the result was actually surprisingly close to the consistency of pottery, terracotta. It doesn't obviously have the integrity of refined clay, but you get the idea. This shows just how much clay is in our soil here. My solution to the problem at the time, of course, was the raised bed setup that I've shown on film a number of times already. And don't get me wrong, it worked, but as I mentioned earlier, it was expensive. I've probably sunk a few $1,000s into the lumber, which is ultimately going to rot away and need to be replaced at some point, and also the soil, which turned out to be the most expensive part of the project. Luckily, a lot of the cost of my setup out there was offset by the pandemic stimuluses that were being sent out a few years ago here in the US. So it wasn't like I was rating, what came in from my paycheck to make them. But still, I kind of got to thinking recently if there might have been a cheaper way to get a thriving garden going. So last January, I was feeling a little bit bored and looking for a dad project to do. And I started looking into ways to amend clay soil to make it into something more growable, a little more fertile. And it turns out that in spite of all of the special products they have out there and talk about stirring in a bunch of garden gypsum, which apparently is only a temporary solution, the consensus was the best way to turn clay soil into usable soil is by stirring in a lot of organic matter and letting it break down. And when that happens, you go from clay apparently into loam, and loam is great for plants. So I marked out an area out there, grabbed my pickaxe, a shovel, and I got to work to see if I could make a garden, a couple of garden beds using only our clay soil, a Home Depot gift card that I happened across, and a lot of physical effort. The first thing I did was a little site prep. I cleared the area where the new gardens are going to go, and I marked out the footprint of the new beds. This is a 2.5 foot wide by 15 foot long strip of ground near the eastern edge of our property. Don't let that black soil right there on the surface fool you. That's just what was left over after I removed a couple of old rotting garden beds. Right under that little sprinkling of good soil is nothing but clay. I can already see this project's going to be a little bit more laborious than I initially anticipated. For reasons unexplained, A concrete border just in from the fence line surrounds our entire property. I have no idea why whoever saw fit to build this did so, but I'm going to have to bust this up with a sledgehammer at some point because it's right in the way of what I want to do. Next, it was time to start digging. Because I wanted to keep this project as inexpensive as possible, and a rototiller rental in my area costs about $80 a day, I opted to till by hand using a shovel and ultimately a pickaxe. Yeah, a rototiller would have made the whole process a lot faster and a lot easier, but I will always opt to spend labor over cash whenever I have the opportunity. Also, as you can tell by looking at me, I kind of need the exercise, and shoveling a whole bunch of saturated clay in the middle of the winter is way cheaper than a gym membership. Ultimately, it took me maybe a week of mostly working on my lunch breaks, 45 minutes a time, to get this whole entire trench shoveled out. The concrete border turned out to be easier to deal with than I anticipated. It was pretty old and rotten, so I made short work of it with a sledgehammer and pickaxe. Getting rid of the concrete chunks, however, is going to be a bit of an issue because municipal waste does not accept them. Some of you might be wondering why I'm digging as deeply as I am for this garden bed. I'm going down well over a foot. I find that the deeper you can make a garden bed in a drought prone area like the Sacramento Valley, the better. The deeper roots go, the more they stay in moisture in the dead of the summer without as much watering as you would need for, say, a shallow 1 foot deep bed. Next, it was time to start refilling the trench while blending organic matter into the clay soil. For my base layer organic matter, I'm using my lower quality materials. This is the chipped up remains of a glossy privet tree that I had to take down over the winter due to some safety concerns. I also wound up stirring in shredded cardboard and paper to this base layer. Obtaining cheap, clean organic matter in a urban suburban setting is actually kind of difficult. It's not like when you live in the woods like I did when I was growing up, where you can just simply walk out of your back door and collect enough rotting organic material to fill a garden in no time. This is the part of the project where I found myself really wishing that I had some kind of powered tiller or cultivator. I mean, who would have thought that stirring wood chips into wet clay soil wouldn't exactly be a great time? But I powered through for the cause. Having exhausted my supply of chipped up tree branches, I had to resort to also blending in some shredded cardboard and paper, which is fine. As I mentioned earlier, organic matter is really at a premium in an urban setting. I also realized that my initial trench is now full, but I have plenty of soil left over that I need to accommodate. So, unfortunately, as much as I didn't want to, I'm going to have to build some raised garden beds, and I'm going to do it for as cheaply as humanly possible. As luck would have it, I happened to have a $50 Home Depot card laying around, resulting from one of those employee incentive programs that my workplace was running at some point. So I didn't have to spend too much out of pocket for the lumber and screws to build my raised beds. My bed design here is super cheap, super simple. I'm just using inexpensive cedar fence pickets for the side panels, and then I'm going to cut some 2x4 posts for corner posts. It should be pointed out that while my electric miter saw here makes cutting the pieces for the garden bed a lot easier and faster, you certainly don't need expensive tools to build something like this. This could easily be done with an electric circular saw and a cordless drill. Or I guess if you're a masochist, it could be done with a handsaw and hammer and nails. With all my posts and panels cut, it's now time to start assembly. As this comes together, some of you might be thinking, hey, that looks kind of flimsy. And yep, it is. And some of you might be thinking, that's kind of ugly. And it is, but I don't care because it's going in a spot where I'm not going to have to look at it every day. Again, the whole point of this project was to do this for as little money as possible. I kind of wanted to prove to myself that I didn't have to spend, or nobody actually has to spend thousands of dollars in raised bed materials and filler to have a successful backyard garden. So yeah, the sides are probably going to bow out a bit, but you know what? It will hold dirt, it will grow plants. With the beds completed and leveled roughly in place, it's now time to resume the oh so tedious process of blending organic matter into the clay soil and refilling. In case anyone's wondering, the depth of the wooden part of the beds themselves is about 15 inches. So between that and the amount that I've excavated downward, there's about 24 inches of root space available. Into the top layers of soil, I'm blending organic matter that's going to break down a lot faster than the wood chips and cardboard I used for the base layer. Specifically, this consists of lawn clippings, kitchen scraps, and a lot of alfalfa hay that we had been using for chicken bedding during the winter. In order to break up any large clumps of clay and facilitate a more even blend with the compostable materials, I'm running everything through a sifter as I put it back in the beds. As you can imagine, this was a tremendously tedious and arduous process, and at this point, I was really getting sick of the project and just wanted it done. At least the softer organic material stirred in a lot easier than the wood chips, so that was a small mercy. And finally, after a ton of physical labor, the project is done. The beds are filled, covered, and will be ready for planting come spring. During the spring and summer growing season, I planted each bed with a combination of bush variety butternut squash and sweet potato, and both crops did surprisingly well given that it was recently amended clay soil. I wound up getting about 20 pounds of squash out of the two beds combined and a combined 35 pounds of sweet potatoes out of the beds. So that's encouraging. With the plants out of the way, I wanted to check the consistency of the soil after one season. As expected, the surface of the soil receded significantly as the organics decomposed. A quick check with the shovel reveals that the soil is still very soft. Although, as expected, there are still plenty of large clay clumps that never fully broke down, overall, I'm really impressed with the results of the project. I certainly wasn't expecting the beds to be as productive as they were over the summer, nor was I expecting the soil to remain as workable as it is, having been amended only once. So there you have it. If your soil, like mine, is very heavy in clay, it's more than doable to amend it into something more arable without spending a ton of money. This is especially true if you have access to a large quantity of free compost. Now, if I was starting my gardens from scratch again, would I avoid building my raised bed setups entirely? It's hard to say. Hindsight's 2020, and there was honestly a lot about building the raised beds that I did enjoy. Also, as you saw, I didn't completely get out of having to build a raised bed frame just by using the native soil as a base. One thing I do know for sure, though, is that if I ever attempt a project like this again, I'm definitely spending the money on a rototiller rental. Thanks for watching. I'm doing my best here to get my feet under me as a content creator. I'm a gardener first and a content creator second, so being on camera is not a natural thing for me. So if you, for whatever reason, decide to stick out this video to the end, I really appreciate it, and I'm going to do my best coming up. All right.